Okay, great. Thank you everyone so much for being here. So thank you so much for joining us. And we are very honored to have Professor Sandra Torres from Uppsala University in Sweden as our speaker today. So Professor Torres is the world's leading scholar on critical social gerontology. Her work also contributes significantly to the fields of sociology of race and ethnicity and migration. She is widely recognized for her studies that problematize OH-related constructs. Her work shed critical light on commonly used methods in health and social care and deconstructed some of the taken for granted assumptions that guide policy and practice for older populations. So since 2021, she has been the editor-in-chief of Aging and Society, one of the leading journals in the socio-behavioral sciences of aging. She was the past president of the ISA Research Committee on Aging. I think that's where I first met you,
Yeah.
and has involved in many in the leadership positions in several others professional organizations. Her latest book, Ethnicity and OH, Expanding Our Imagination, received a book award from the Gerontological Society of America recently. So she had a long list of career accomplishments, but I could go on and on. But without further ado, please let me now invite Professor Torres to share her recent research with us, and it's titled Expanding Our Scholarly Imagination on Civic Engagement in Later Life while unleashing the potential of aging society. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Park.
So let
Uh,
me share screen and you just let me know when you want
yeah.
me to move. Okay, great.
So
Everyone
welcome,
can see it?
everyone. I hope
Great.
everybody can see it. And I hope you will be able to follow along. I have 40 minutes at my disposal, and I am saying good morning to you. I'm based in Sweden, as she said, in Stockholm at the moment, not in Uppsala. I am addressing you from my own library, my personal library. So this is how it looks like, and you can tell based on the garland in the back that I love Christmas. So it's still hanging up in there, even though Easter is fast approaching. So today I will be addressing you in one of the projects that I am involved at the moment in. I work on several projects usually at the same time. This one is on civic engagement, and it felt as it was the one that potentially was most interesting to your part of the world. So that's the reason why we chose it. And I will be addressing you, giving you both an insight into how civic engagement research on old age has looked like, but also a little bit of how the civics project looks like. And this is a project that we are finalizing in September, October. Be working on it for 3 years, and I will give you a little bit of a glimpse of some data coming from it so you get an idea of why it is that at least I, as member of the team, think that we have enormous potential to actually expand the imagination on civic engagement. I tend to use that title quite often. And a lot of times I tend to be rather provocative when people say, how come you're working on aging? And I usually say, well, it's not necessarily that I am that concerned about older people. And that tends to throw people off because they presume that people are working on aging, old age, or elderly care are particularly fond of people in that part of the life course. But in my case, what I am particularly interested on, it's a way in which social gerontologies perceive the world and the limitations that those perceptions can place, not only on older people, but also on the policymakers and practitioners that work in meeting their needs. I think that the science usually should expand the imagination of others, but it doesn't always does that. And one of the reasons that you will see that's the case in civic engagement research today, it's because we tend to get quite easily stuck in what philosophers call the context of justification. So we usually say that when you're trying to increase knowledge or target knowledge production in a way that it's aiming at sort of figured out what do we know about X, Y, and Z, we usually go from a context of discovery where everything is sort of new and try to map out how do we measure that knowledge that we're trying to gain insight to. And then we move into a context of justification. But we tend to move to the context of justification quite often very, very fast. And then we start piling and accumulating that data on conceptual frameworks and sometimes theoretical frameworks that may be sort of lacking certain parts of that reality that we're trying to measure. So what I will be doing today then is move along on that. And I will like my first slide and one slide at a time. So I'll be saying to Puck next, because unfortunately we didn't get it to work from here. I'll give you the bigger picture first. Why focus on civic engagement in Europe at the moment? Now, the first idea, please first, next. The first reason is that we're living in tumultuous times, at least in our part of the world. And what that means, Puck, we need to
Oops,
keep
sorry.
keep at it. Yeah, we're living in tumultuous time in this part of the world. At least we have geopolitical problems, economic, social, cultural, and so on and so forth. At times like this, the fabric of society needs to really hold on so that we as human beings can continue to be kind and supportive of one another. So that's one reason why civic engagement is in the minds of policymakers and research funders in Europe at the moment. Next, please. We have also numerous countries that are experiencing threats to the democratic system of governance that they have relied on. And that too requires that we're not leading a life where polarization is at the very core of how we interact with one another. And we only need to look at the other side of the pond where I used to come from and where my old boss is still lurking in the back. I worked when I was a student at NYU for Donald Trump. So that's who I'm referring to. And we can see what is happening to that particular part of the world as far as this is concerned. Next, please. We also have a lack of social cohesion, and we also are facing, at least in my part of the world, great mental health challenges nonetheless amongst younger people. And that is really threatened the very fabric of our communities in various ways and put a strains on families. I know the center, it's a family and population research center, and this is one of the very core issues that civic engagement research is needing to look at. Next, please. Population aging is also changing the age composition of various societies. And I definitely don't need to say that for your center and the audience that I'm addressing today. But if I show the next for this one, then you will see that in Europe, where I'm based, this process is being driven by historically low fertility rates. It's increasing life expectancy, and in some parts of Europe, migratory patterns. The net flows of migration that sometimes even happen in old age of all times in the life course within European member states. We have something called international migration, retirement migration, IRM, and that is a phenomenon that we're seeing quite largely in Europe, where you have Northern Europeans moving to Southern Europeans. Here's the population pyramid. I'm pretty sure you're all very familiar with, but this one is for the EU27, and you see women and men, and you also see where it looked like in terms of population stats for 2019, and how we are expecting it to be when we're doing our prospects on this for 2050. So this is the kind of population pyramid that is sort of driving some policymakers to great concern these days. Next, please. With regards to the part of the world where I'm based, Eurostat shows, next, and I'll walk you through that Europeans are living longer than ever before, and the age profiles of our society is developing at a fast pace. Next. We also know that the proportion of people of working age is, in other words, shrinking, while the group of older people is expanding. Next, please. We also know that the 65 plus population will increase significantly, rising from 90.5 million in the starts of 2019 to close to 130 million in 2050. Next, please. We also know that by 2050, there will be 13.5% fewer people aged less than 55 years of age in this particular part of the world. Next. We also know that the number of people in the 75 to 84 years of age, what we tend to call in social gerontology the old, is projected to expand by 56.1%, while the young old, 65 to 74 years of age, is projected to increase by 16.6%. Next. Women are also outnumbering men at older ages for quite some time now, and there were many more very old older women aged 85 plus um, than men in 2019. Next, please. By 2050, the EU27 expects to have close to 500,000 centenarians. So you could probably see the reasons why population aging is in a lot of policymakers' minds. And next, please. We also have developments that are having, of course, profound implications. And none of this is new to any of you, I presume, but it is a good way of sort of giving you the backdrop of the presentation. Next, please. So we are experiencing a set of challenges and are expecting those to arise when it comes to health and social care systems, labor markets, pension entitlements, and so on. And that is the reason why we're seeing the increase in retirement plans age for retirement, which has driven, as you probably may remember, people in Greece and in France to demonstrate, to civically engage in one way through which you can do it through demonstrations to make their voice heard, so to speak. Next, please. So if we move on to the old dependency ratio, next, we know that although this is highly criticized by social gerontologists because it relies on chronological age, which we know it's not a good indicator for a life course approach to the aging process, nonetheless, it's the one ratio that it tends to be used when policymakers speaks to one another about what population aging can mean. And we know that that ratio is wobbling to such an extent because the actual group that potentially could provide through their own paid work as well as informal help support to older populations, the 20 to 64 age group that we tend to refer to, it's going to be increasing then. Next, please. By 2019, that old age dependency ratio was 34%, and there were fewer than 3 persons of working age for every older person in this part of the world. Next. Back in 21, just as a reference point, the ratio was at 25.9%. So we're seeing that increase. Back then, it was fewer than 4 persons of working age for every aged person 65 and over. Next, please. Eurostat projections for the EU27 suggest then that this ratio will continue to climb and it will reach to 56.7% by 2050. So there will be fewer than 2 persons of working age for each older person. Next, please. Now, let me now move you into civic engagement. This is the backdrop, what I just gave you. And now we move on to what do we know about civic engagement in old age, in that specific group that policymakers are concerned about. And what we've done is that we started this project, and just to give you a little bit of a backdrop, here in Europe, there is something called cost actions. And cost actions are a European Commission way of encouraging researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to meet on a 4-year continual basis. They meet twice a year, and then in between have whole sets of homeworks. And we had a social exclusion cost action back in 2016. I think it began 2017, if I'm not mistaken. What we had to do was map out what do we know about social exclusion in old age. We were grouped into 5 groups of what is called working teams, and I led together with Ariella Lowenstein the team that looked into civic exclusion. So it is out of the cost action civic exclusion group that we did a certain sets of inventories of knowledge, in this case through the procedures known as scoping reviews. And one of the things that we did was publish these 3 pieces of work. The first 2 are about mapping the last 50 years of research on older person civic engagement. And those are led, the primary author there, it's Rodrigo Serrat, who is a postdoc that chose to spend his time as a member of the RoseNet action, the cost action I mentioned about, visiting my department and working with me. And the result of our work is in that last article. These articles map out basically what do we know? How does the scholarly imagination on civic engagement looks like if we take that pulse? What do we know? What do we need to find out? And it is on the basis of the three scoping reviews that we ended up designing the civics project. Next, please. So the scoping reviews showed the following. Next. First, we showed that out of the 429 peer review articles focusing on civic engagement in later life, we looked up until 2017, we have next only 81 articles that were empirically focusing on experiences of civic engagement. So we were measuring how are people civically engaged, most of the time by looking at one dimension of civic engagement and not in a multidimensional fashion. And we were also very seldom looking at meaning making. How do people actually in old age make sense of civic engagement? How do they think of civic engagement? How do they conceptualize civic engagement? And why do they think that civic engagement might be something worth investing their time on? Next, please. Out of those 349 articles that were empirically based, focusing on experiencing mostly, 62% came from the US. So we didn't have enough information about the European continent when it came to civic engagement in old age. Only 17% of the articles came from European projects, and all of them were relying on one or two dimensions of civic engagement. And this is a multidimensional perspective in civic engagement, as I will be telling you pretty soon. Next, please. These Scopus reviews also expose blind spots when it comes to civic engagement literature. And one of them had to do with one psychologist these days called, next, weird populations, which I find it quite funny of a term. And what that means is that psychologists have noted that the large bulk of evidence for their interest areas tends to come from samples that are wealthy, educated, industrialized based from those countries that are fairly rich and that come from democratic societies. So we tend to conduct research. Our imagination is populated. What we call the state of the arts of the evidence base tend to be based on these weird populations. And we then transport that know-how and start to then move on from the concept of discovery to the concept of justification, and then try to see whether the less privileged groups flare as well as the privileged groups. But we never ask the non-privileged groups, do you actually make sense of whatever it is that we're measuring in the same way as we are expecting you to do based on this weird based kind of samples? Next, please. We also noted that most of the research on social exclusion, but also on civic engagement specifically, was pointing towards the indication that the groups that could be at the highest risk of social exclusion were not the groups that we were engaging when looking at doing data collection on civic engagement in old age. So the very groups that we ought to be concerned about and the very groups that we ought to know that could benefit from civic engagement, because we've been already seeing the evidence, at least for those privileged groups, that civic engagement does work in terms of increasing health, subjective health, and quality of life, for example, in old age. So we know that it is a propitious activity to work on, potentially based on these weird populations. And the people that are at the most risk of social exclusion and at the most risk of not being civically engaged, we didn't have information on them. Next, please. We also knew that Europeans were not being dealt with as much. And what we wanted to ask in the civics project was, could the population of groups at risk of civic engagement and groups that are also not weird, could they expand the imagination on civic engagement in old age and potentially beyond? Next, please. So, what is civic engagement? Next, and you can just cross as many of them as possible. It is basically this. I tend not to use that many pictures of my presentations, and I tend, as you've probably already seen, to use a lot of text. Part of the reason for that is that I also take for granted that I cannot sustain the imagination of the people that are listening to me for that long. So by giving you text, I am giving you the opportunity to, if your mind went to wander off to groceries potentially, right? We're getting heading to Friday afternoon, and most people have maybe thinking of their grocery list. If that were to happen, you can read the text. But these are actually pictures just showing you what civic engagement could be. It's volunteering, it's informal help given outside of the family. It's political participation of various kinds, everything from voting to demonstrating to being a member of a political party or to even being part of a political organization that does lobby on a specific issue, for example. But we also have associational activities. And what that means is all sorts of activities that are about improving individuals or communities or societies at large in various ways. This could happen digitally or it could happen in real life. Next, please. So this part of the presentation, you can to all three of the slides there, all three of the texts. It is based on Civics, and Civics is a GPI funded, more years, better life funded program that also receives funding from the 4 national funding organizations that are involved in the project. We chose um, parts of Europe where who have dissimilar welfare regimes, but similar aging populations. And we also are engaged in a project that is looking at multidimensional civic engagement in later life, the experiences of social exclusion potentially, but also conceptualizations of civic engagement. And we're trying to identify evidence-based policy responses to address civic engagement and the need for that to be expanded. Next, please. Now, the civics has 2 legs, so to speak. The quantitative next is looking at secondary data that is trying to examine the influence of micro, meso, and macro level variables on multidimensional civic engagement. We've already started to publish on that. 2023 was our first publication in the European Journal of Aging Studies. And we, in that one, are looking at shared data and what it says about civic engagement. The bits of shared data that allows us to do civic engagement, and that's solely volunteering and solely political participation. Now, the qualitative part of civics is looking at experiencing a trajectory of civic engagement among potentially marginalized groups of older people, and we're doing it through a life course setup. So we have 240 live course interviews, and we have 60 interviews in these 4 countries, and we focus on 4 groups of older people who are potentially at risk of social exclusion, but also at risk of not being civically engaged to the extent that policymakers worried about population aging would want them to be, so to speak. Next, please. So the variable that we asked from the UQLS from 2016 was looking at participation, political participation, and this is the one that I'll be showing you particularly. And it is looking at voluntary work, attending meetings related to trade unions, political parties, attending a protest or a demonstration, signing a petition, contacting a political or public official, or boycotting products. That it was the measurement used in the UKLS to actually look into whether or not people were politically engaged. Already here, you see a gliding of terminology. It's not called civic engagement in this one. It is called political participation in this particular data set. Next, please. So here's a map that gives you an idea of how Europe looks when it comes to civic engagement in political activities as defined by the previous. And it is from the past 12 months. That tends to be the way through which we measure civic engagement. And what you can see here is what different parts of Europe flare like. You can see that Romania is at 6% of their older population are engaged in those activities. Bulgaria is at 8%, Portugal at 9%. Denmark is around 40, Austria around 40, and Sweden, where I'm based, is at 64, which is the largest level of civic engagement. Associational activities being at the very core of what Nordic countries tend to be heavily involved in. Next, please. In terms of voluntary work, you also see the differences between the countries. And again, the closer you are to Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, the likelier the chance that you have a lower score when it comes to civic engagement. And um, on average, you tend to have a higher percentage of people engaged in the 65 plus category on volunteering, the higher up they come in Europe. Next, please. Now, looking at share data instead, and share is the data sets that look specifically into longitudinal aspects that are interesting for us in old age and aging research. We did an analysis of share data looking, next please, at 74,150 Europeans, age 50 plus. We chose a lower age group in the wave 7 of share in order to look at whether or not they were civically engaged. Next, please. We were looking at multivariate logistic regression analysis to explore the predictors of those two types of civic engagement that we had information on. And we're looking at the native-born population and the foreign-born population, because here in Europe, we're also very concerned about the fact that it's not only population aging that is changing the demographic composition of our populations, it is also international migration. We have received a large proportion of people from around the world, and we have a diverse population, not only in terms of old age and aging aspects, but also in terms of ethnicity and race and background. So for the foreign-born population, we wanted to also look at whether or not there were associations between age upon migration and citizenship in the country where people were originally born, or in the country where they're based now. Next, please. The results show that native born compared to European foreign born, but not to non-European foreign born, participate less in volunteering and political organizations that one might expect. So it's the non-European foreign born that had the highest scores when it came to this. Next, please. In line with this, we also saw that all the migrant civic engagement is suggesting, and that is that foreign-born older people who migrated earlier in life were more likely to engage in volunteer and charity work. We did not see a relationship between citizenship in the host country and engagement, which we were surprised about. Next, please. Now, we now look into the qualitative study. We know that research on older civic engagement has failed to address the diversity. I hinted at that already. And that most studies have been based on easy to reach populations. Next, please. We also know that Civic has collected the 240 interviews with the 4 groups, and I will walk you through the 4 groups. And these interviews have been conducted in Belgium, Finland, Spain, and Sweden. And it is older people living in social disadvantaged urban areas. It is, next please, it is older people living at home or aging in place, as we sociologists tend to refer to them, who receive health and social services via formal welfare scheme. It's also older people living in long-term care settings or housing for which they need a formal need assessment, but it is housing most, not long-term care setting, because people in Northern Europe who are in long-term care setting are too frail to manage an interview as long as these interviews are. And last but not least, we have people who are foreign-born and migrated to Europe in adulthood, and most of the sample, except in Finland, when there is not enough migrants of a non-European background, because most of the migrants that they have in this age group are Russian speakers, but mostly we're focused on those who are non-European, have come to Europe in adulthood. So those are the 4 groups that Civics have collected data on. Next, please. Here's a sociodemographic profile. It just gives you an idea of how each of these groups flare in terms of variables such as education, self-rated health, limitations for activities of daily living, which is what ADL stands for, and you have difficulty in making ends meet. Not surprisingly, when it comes to difficulty in making ends meet, you see the highest percentages found in the migrant groups. And when it comes to educational levels, we also see a high proportion of migrants with educational levels that are fairly high. In terms of self-rated health, we see that the highest percentage of people who are with poor health or indicate self-rated health of being poor are people living at home, receiving home health care, which is perfectly understandable considering the policies for aging in place that we've had in Europe for many years. Thank you. My coffee just arrived from my darling husband. Next, please. In terms of civic engagement, we also did a short survey on civic engagement first before starting all of the interviews to get a baseline of where people were at in the past um, 12 months. And this comes from Theo Carey's and then DEF 2015 questionnaire, which is one of the questionnaires that is often used when it comes to civic engagement in old age. And this one looks, among other things, at informal health behaviors. It looks at associational participation. It looks at formal volunteering, and it looks at political participation. And here you have scores. I will not walk you necessarily through them right now, but I've marked in the bolded red color, which hopefully can be seen at your end, that who are the ones in the various groups that actually are scoring the highest in terms of civic participation during the last 12 months. Next, please. Now, let me give you a little bit of highlights. What we've done in the 240 interviews is that we pre-coded them in Excel first while the data was being collected before we did thematic analysis, which is what we've been working on over the past few months. The Excel file that we've used, we met once a week for a whole year, little over a year, to actually enter into the Excel the inductively formulated replies that we receive from our informants or participants to all of the questions. So the Excel sheet that has the content analysis or the content basis for the interviews contains 329 columns dealing with 202 themes. By recording the data this way, we're being able to identify the patterns where most qualitative efforts should be placed next, and that's what we're working on right now. And today I'll be presenting some of the main trends observed using bar charts so that you can visualize the data as a whole. Next, please. The results are preliminary because we haven't done the thematic analysis. So anybody who is a qualitatively inclined person, please know that we're dealing with content analysis right now, and we're just trying to identify where do we have enough data in these 240 interviews to dig further into. Next, please. Here we show you a little bit of these inductively offered explanations what civic engagement means, and this starts to get very interesting here. In your red, you see all of those inductively giving, all of this spontaneous answer to the question, how do you define civic engagement, that these older people gave us? And what you see in the red is that most people are defining civic engagements in ways that are not the ways in which we're measuring it. Nobody, when they are measuring civic engagement, are asking people, do you feel that you contribute to society? For example, what we're asking is, do you volunteer? Do you help someone? Do you political participate? Are you a member in associations? Are you voting? It is a gray portion that the context of justification when it comes to the scholarly imagination on civic engagement tends to be consumed by. But nobody asked older people necessarily, what do you consider to be a civic activity? What do you consider to be the way through which you contribute to society? The way in which you feel as if you're doing your very best to contribute to your neighborhood. And when you go into that, you see all kinds of things, from keeping oneself updated to having an ecological mindset and recycling, to doing household chores, to being with older people. Next, please. If you look at a civic engagement, you can show the entire thing, Buck. If you look at an entire just an excerpt from this, you think that this is a person who's talking about what they believe civic engagement to be. And for them, it's about being in the neighborhood. They believe, for example, in this case, that because they are based in a social disadvantaged neighborhood, which is particularly interested in this case, it is their duty, so to speak, civically, to keep themselves updated as to what is actually happened in their neighborhood, because they know that the news press, the national news press, will be inclined to talk about all the things that are happening that are potentially detrimental to that neighborhood. They never comment on the good things that happen in the neighborhood. They only comment on the bad things that happen in the neighborhood. So for these older people living in such neighborhoods, making sure that they could not contribute to the spread of rumors about their neighborhood and being able to say to other people, well, that's not quite what happened in our own backyard, was very important. And they considered to be a part of their civic duty, so to speak. Next, please. So, although informant statements about civic engagement were for the most part aligned, as you could see from the gray pie chart that I show you, there were also others suggesting that thinking about active citizenship or civic engagement needed to be thought through in different ways. Next. Next, again, these are some of the areas of which we're interested in looking at because we have life course interviews and it's life transitions and critical events. It's socio-historical events influencing our preparedness to engage civically. We have tons of data on that. It is about how people's civic engagement could be nourished or encouraged by their own professional identity or their personal beliefs. And it could also be things like the circumstances that pose challenge to civic engagement. And to our amazement, it is not so that socially disadvantaged people that live in social disadvantaged neighborhood or in long-term housing are not engaging. In fact, they sometimes feel and talk about as if it is precisely because they're based in those settings that they need to be civically engaged. Next, please. Here are some of the types of engagement and the way in which old age could be considered an obstacle. And I won't show you to all of this and necessarily talk to you about, but these are people that are thinking that old age is an obstacle to accept different types of engagement. And as you can see here, it is actually less than 30%, sometimes even as low as less than 15% who consider their old age to be an obstacle. And this is important for us to keep in mind, considering, as I mentioned, policy developments. Next, please. People even thought in some cases that old age could be enabling civic engagement because, of course, they're retired, they feel relatively engaged, they have experience, and so on and so forth. You can show the next one, please, Spock. Thank you so much. So with regards to the engagement, what we see is that we have obstacles to civic engagement, but also enablers to civic engagement. And what we believe is that there's more capacity for civic engagement in privileged groups of older people because there is as much apparently in the groups that we have interviewed through these 240 interviews. Next, please. So in finalizing this presentation, I will ask you for the next one and the next one as well. And I will ask you for the next one because my time is running up. Next as well. I will then finalize with this one. Stop. So why do we think that civic engagement research of the type that we're doing right now is important? First of all, because as I said, from the scoping reviews and the vast amount of research that we have reviewed prior to designing the project, we know that the scholarly imagination on civic engagement does not regard older people as people that are theoretically propitious to interview and or engage with. We're measuring through the context of justification, but we are not regarding them as a potentially interesting source of information for the context of discovery. We also know that our imagination presumes that we are facing all sorts of challenges in our aging populations as well. And yes, population aging is a crisis and it is perceived to be a challenge if we think that it is the way in which we've been designing our societies that we will continue. But if we start thinking of population aging as a blessing, as a testament of how advancements has led to the expansion of our life expectancy, then we could also look at it as how do we make and tap into the potential that older people are. So, what I am arguing today, social scientists could contribute to solutions to the challenges that we're facing and not just contributing to mapping out where the challenges lie. And what we'd like to say today is the last two things that are said there. Good times breed confidence, bad times breed character. So let us use Stacey Abrams, a American politician who once said, let us move forward because moving back is not an option and standing still is not enough. And let us think of civic engagement as a potential activity that can unleash the potential of our aging populations. Thank you so much for your attention today. Here is who at Civic Engagement Civics. Our leader in the consortium is Rodrigo Serrat. He's based in Spain. Here are the leaders for the different studies, and it tells you which universities are based. And last, I would like to give a thanks with our next slide to our data collectors based in all of these countries who have painstakingly collected the 240 interviews that we led. And I also give a shout out to Marina and Toon, who are behind some of the analysis for the quantitative data, some of which I showed you today. Thank you again for your attention. That's all I had.
Thank you so much. Let's see if there's any questions for Sandra.
Thank you, Christy. I think you're applauding. I see your.
So anyone wants to ask the first question? Abhijit, please, you can turn on your mic and camera if you want to.
Thanks, Hook. Sorry, my
Sorry.
computer requires that I restart it for the camera to start
Uh,
working.
yeah, no
I have too
worries.
many windows that are open. My apologies. Um,
Yeah, maybe
thank you,
you can
Professor
introduce
Torres.
yourself a
Sure.
little bit, Abhijit.
Certainly, Puk. Thank you. Professor Torres, hi. I'm a big fan of your work. I'm
Oh,
Abhijit. I'm a principal research scientist here at Duke NUS at the Center for Aging Research and Education.
okay.
Um, yes, we're a small social science research center that does work on aging-related issues situated here in Singapore, primarily working on Singapore. Thanks for the presentation. I was fascinated by the qualitative study, even though I'm a quantitative researcher myself, but where you found that the definitions that were offered in your qualitative studies of civic engagement, weren't what we typically
Yeah.
conceptualize civic engagement as. But I was curious about a couple of things.
Yeah.
One, that would, for example, the study have shown respondents the existing definitions, right? Or the existing questions
Mm,
related to how civic engagement is defined by scholars, by academics, by the
yeah.
survey itself, and then ask them, would you
Mm,
consider this civic engagement? Right?
mm,
That I thought would have given some really interesting insights on what the questions were themselves trying to do.
yeah.
So that was one. I was wondering whether you considered that. So that
Yeah.
that was one part. Yeah,
So
carry on.
yeah, so to some extent, the design of the actual life course interview sort of follows that because
Hmm.
the first question we ask is how do you define it?
Right.
But then we go through all five. This is why it's a very long interview.
Okay.
And I was working with psychologists.
Hmm.
So it pretty much felt as if we were posing a survey to an interview.
Right.
Not the way I would have done it, but still. We go through each of the multidimensional and then we ask, this is the way it is thought through. Can you tell me what you think about it? Have you
I
engaged?
see.
We
Hmm.
use not only interviews, but life diagrams because we're
Hmm.
dealing with older people and we know from research on older people that is as extensive and it's life course based that sometimes having a life diagram could help. So people have this little diagram where they will dot. They say, well, I did a lot of this when I
Hmm.
was young, and then it died out at this time because of X, Y, and Z. So that was a way through which we can keep track of what they were saying about their life course and the ways in which they went in and out engagement in different types
Hmm.
of civic activities. And it was a way as well for them to sort of keep track of what we were talking about. So we didn't ask precisely, this is how a survey would
Hmm.
ask you the question, but
Hmm.
we say, let us now move on to volunteering. Volunteering is one of the activities that is perceived to be. By volunteering, we mean what's that? Do you engage in this?
I
Do you
see.
think about
Hmm.
that? Have you done it before? Why haven't you done it? And just to give you a very interesting thing with the migrant group, for example, they said along things along the lines of, yeah, volunteering. I never thought of it. Like we don't have a word where I come from. So for me, volunteering was with ladies with blue hair. I have a beautiful quote. Ladies with blue hair that were very rich tend to do when they went to
I
hospitals in my country. So they didn't think of the things that they did in their own communities at volunteering. So they didn't
see.
label it volunteering. But as the
Mhm.
interviews progressed, a lot of people started to realize, wait a second, I do a lot more. than what I presume I did. And part of the time was because as they were thinking out loud, and remember they were requested to think out loud about this through the live course, then they were able to sort of say, yeah, I used to do that before. And does this count? This was one of the questions. Does this count? For example. So it didn't follow the actual use the, the carries and then death questionnaire that way. And we did use the questionnaire, as I said, with them as well. But it was more, this is how it's defined, and this is how it tends to be. There tend to be formal ways of doing this and informal ways of doing it. Could we talk about that? And then people will start to draw on their life diagram and start to tell us one thing at a time. And then we would have to revisit back and forth between the multidimensional, because it's very difficult to keep such a long interview on track when we're dealing with a live course interview. Yeah.
No, certainly. I mean, just one quick sort of follow-up. So what did you make of the responses that said, I think if I recall correctly, going outside, right? Or sort of being with others. I thought those were
Yeah. So it's an array of different things. It's an array of different things. Some of the being outside.
I think that you showed on the right-hand side.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So going outside.
Or being outside, right?
Yeah. So going outside, it could be things along the way of, at my age, I need to make sure that I keep myself active. And one way through which I keep my both my body and my mind up is by going outside, being exposed to new things, being able to socialize, keep myself, the social part of myself. There's this a beautiful quote somebody said, keeping the social part of myself alive. And you can't do that in your four walls. So it's things that sort of communicate that they have a clear idea, in a way, being a social gerontologist, they have a clear idea what healthy aging is about. And they're thinking, I need to do my very best to do the kinds of things that would keep me contributing to society in one way or another, or at least making sure that I don't become a burden to my family or to welfare state in that case. So it can be all sorts of things that we weren't thinking about. I mean, recycling, none of us thought recycling could be, but they thought, the environment, the younger generation are very angry about the way the environment is. And I have, the municipality has invested on these things. I've never sorted out trash in my entire life. But sorting out trash is what these younger people say. Here in Sweden, of course, we have Greta Thunberg. So the interviewers will say, Greta has told us that we need to recycle. So my generation needs to make sure, and people will say things like, it can just be going to the recycling station. But by making sure that I do it, not leaving it in front of my door so that my son or my daughter will do it for me, I am doing something that keeps me doing as much as I can. So it's an interesting thing of thinking, in a way you could say, which it's a dream, so to speak, for policymakers. And I'm very weary of what this means. But for policymakers, these people seem to be very conscious. Now, remember, in order to find them, we had to go through an array of ways of finding them. So it could be that we're dealing with people that are particularly civilly key, but we did have people who did not do anything, or interviews that were fairly short because they said, no, I'm not interested. I'm no longer doing that. Or I did that. But they were in the fewer numbers than what we had expected. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. Thank you very much.
I think
my name is sorry.
Okay,
Can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Bibi, and I'm just I'm very actively involved in civic engagement in my country, which is Singapore. And I just want to ask, in your study, whether you look at some of the civic engagements of the seniors, and whether they are ground up initiatives, because in Singapore, we have rising number of ground up initiatives, which are started by people because there are gaps in society. Like, we are a rapidly developing, urbanizing country where a lot of old buildings are destroyed. So we get a lot of heritage groups which are ground up initiatives, a lot of environmental groups that look at different areas of the environment and protecting them. So I'm just thinking about, because you list the number of countries in Europe and the percentage of people involved in civic engagement, and how many of those are ground up initiatives? How many of those arise because people see a need to fill up a gap in society? Yeah. Thank
Grow up. I'm not sure I understand you, BB. Grow up? What does that mean?
I think ground up
Oh, okay.
from
From
the
the bottom
bottom
up.
up.
the
Bottom
ground
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha.
starting
Yeah.
from the people. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't know that from the data we have. Nobody has asked that. So people just, again, in context of justification, we haven't been asking, is this an initiative that has been bottom up or is it top down? I would presume that a large number of them are top down. And I would presume that part of the problem with the context of justification is that we also tend to have certain kinds of civic engagement in mind when we ask those questions. And that might not necessarily be the kinds that people are thinking of. So I cannot answer the question, unfortunately. But we do know, at least in Western Europe, that we're seeing more and more initiatives by older people who are creating their own networks to offer help to others. So this is an interesting initiative that started about 15 or so years ago. We didn't used to have that, but you now have this bureaus that announce on the paper saying we're a group of older people. You can join in if you want to, and people call in and say we would like help with X, Y, and Z. Can you hook me up with an older person who would like to help me? So there are initiatives of this kind that we're seeing more and more, but we don't have, I think, in at least my part of the world, enough of those. And I will give you just a very simple example to give you an idea of the reason why I'm saying this. This is anecdotal, BB, so bear with me. But when I first moved to Sweden, I come from the States. So I come from a tradition where doing voluntary work is a given. I mean, you just do not spend a weekend without doing voluntary work in certain social classes in the US. It's just something you do. So when I first moved, I met a couple of English speakers, women in the same predicament as I was, having all the time in the world in my hands. And I thought, okay, we're learning Swedish. Maybe we can start to read at Swedish hospitals for children because our Swedish is not yet good enough, but we could manage children's book. We tried to do that. This is 30 plus years ago. And we were actually driven out of the hospitals because the trade union said, you're potentially creating a market for yourself, and that's not a job we would like people to have. So we have had a tradition when the welfare state has been very strong to not encourage these bottom up. I'm not saying that this is the case right now. I think what I'm saying that this is part of the way through which a lot of Western Europe's strong welfare communities have thought. It's sort of like it is the state that creates the settings through which channel our contributions to society. But I think we're seeing more and more of that, even in this part of the world as well. But I think it is that formalized way of thinking about civic engagement that may perhaps be the reason why we're not seeing such high numbers of civic engagement in, for example, Eastern Europeans and Southern European countries. But we're not asking them about non-formal ways of engagement. We're asking them for formal ways of engagement. And sometimes, I'm not saying this is the case in the shared data, but I've seen civic engagement questionnaires when people are giving even a suggestion of what an organization could look like. So you're already planting an idea with that. So that means they're tapping into a stereotype of what that kind of formalized civic engagement could look like. And if the person automatically sees that, says, no, I'm not doing that, or even if they think that particular organization is something they wouldn't be associated with, you may not be unleashing the imagination of that person to think in a bottom-up perspective. So I did not answer your question, BB, but your question does preoccupy us greatly.
That's a very interesting answer. I think the context and culture of the country certainly plays a part.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Patron, please.
Hello, Sandra. Thank you so much for your presentation. So this is Peijun from Melbourne. So it's quite late here, but I really enjoy your presentation on the civic engagement. This is also part of my research interest. And especially I read your research framework where you conduct like about 240 interviews, especially that include older adults with migration backgrounds.
Yeah.
So I want to ask more about this. How do you add migration theories into understanding the civic engagement? Because recently I've been started to read about migration process in Western societies. And I was aware that the frustrations or the marginalizations for migrants, especially in Europe and also in Australia, for example. And I just wonder how you interview those older adults and also understand how migration process that experience when they were younger, be it negative or being marginalized, somehow turn into positive way for them to engage in civic engagement. I wonder how you analyze that or if you capture that in your interviews. Thank you.
Yeah. So the interviews of migrants are extremely rich at the moment. I just put together the first paper that I sent to my co-authors. It's looking specifically at migrants and the way in which they conceptualize civic engagement. I am very, very, pardon my French, anal. I don't do a literature review until I code all the literature. So this is my Excel sheet for coding all the literature. If I tell you there's a knowledge gap, I know there's a knowledge gap. So the 58 articles there are on migrant civic engagement, it's only a handful that it's on all the migrants. That's the first thing to say. The other thing is that this literature on migrant engagement collapses ethnicity and ethno-racial minority with migrantship. And those things are not the same necessarily. Yes, some migrants are ethno-racial and a minority, but not all ethnic racial minorities have a migratory background. Okay, the literature tends to collapse them into two. The next thing is that they talk as if in the literature as if you have to teach migrants how to become civically engaged, which for me is baffling. Most people with a migrant background comes from societies where you do not have formalized welfare states, where civic engagement is the very fabric of that society, where helping one another is very core of your survival. So the presumption that they will come to the West and we will teach them how to be civically engaged is for me mind-boggling. With that said, in our interviews, one of the things we find is that they are telling us that it was through formalized associational activities and volunteer work that they were able to learn how to actually understand that new society. So they have seen their civic engagement as the entry point to the Belgian society, the Finnish society, the Swedish society, and the Spanish society, less so for Spain, because a lot of the migrants that we've interviewed, they're non-European, but they tend to have Spanish as their first language. They come from Latin America. So in their case, it's not as much. But in these other countries, they are talking in terms of through civic engagement, I understood the Swedish mentality. I understood the Swedish culture. And I wasn't able to get a job in the beginning because I didn't have the resources language-wise to be able to transport my skills into a language appropriate way to exploit them in this new labor market. Through civic engagement, they were able to tap into those resources and also expand their imagination about what it could mean. But the whole idea that the literature takes for granted that civic engagement is something you teach migrants makes absolutely no sense. So that's what the paper will, among other things, be about. But more to come on that. And if anybody's interested in receiving this sort of work from us, let us know. I'm piling up email. So you can just email me directly and say, I would like to be put on that list. And as we start to publish, we'll send you things your way so that you easily access them. So thank you for your question. I do not know if I answer it, but
that'd be
it was
great.
like
Yes,
trying to.
I will follow up on your publications. Thank you.
Yeah, lovely.
Great. Great, thank you. May I ask one last question?
Yes.
So I saw a lot more literature on social participation, right? Could you comment? And then there's a lot more, I mean, in my impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, like it seems like there's, a number of theoretical framework that people already use to predict social participation.
Yeah.
How is this literature on civic engagement? How it seems like there are some overlapping.
Yeah,
Can you
absolutely.
comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the problems with this area. I was actually baffled by the lack of stringency in definitions. So some people count civically activities as social participation, and some people only count interactions that are smaller in groups that have no purpose of necessarily impacting for the better good of society. So it depends on how you defined it, but they do overlap. So part of the thing that we did, Rodrigo did together with his co-authors on the first two articles that look at the past 50 years, is look at civic engagement in the broader sense, trying to figure it out, where are those overlap? And they have published 2 or 3 articles looking into that. How do you map it? But this is part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that there's a lot of confusion about what civic engagement actually means. So there is a move and a debate that tries to say differentiate between engagement, which is the willingness to contribute positively to your surroundings, from participation, which is the ways through which you do that. Volunteering, political participation, associational engagement, that being the vehicle. But unfortunately, we tend to also mix and match them when we write in our publication. So it is a really interesting terrain. It's fairly new to me. I've been working on it since 2016, 2017, but basically in the first 4 years, I was just reading on it to try to wrap my own head around it. What does it mean? And it's still very tumultuous in terms of the lack of stringency. It's also one of those fields where you have, because of the intimate connection between civic engagement and social participation and health, you have a lot of people doing health research who just automatically go in and try to take the variables that could be interesting for them to measure without having the definitional clarity most of the time. So that also part of what creates the problem, because it's one of those topics that there is quality of life and health tends to be one of the measures that you tend to look in relation to civic engagement of various kinds.
Definitely. Thank you so much for you and your colleagues to pave this way and, help us clarify a number of constructs and concepts. And, we're looking forward to having you back and share the progress of the report and the publications.
Yeah,
and
there will be
all
plenty of
the best.
publication, among others, an edited collection by Policy Press that Rodrigo is editing on civic engagement in old age. So thanks, Pug, for introducing me to this lovely setting. I don't see faces, but I got to hear beautiful voices that sounded very amicable. So thank you to all of you for bringing me in today and for having your attention. Here in Sweden, we will tend to end at the end by saying Glad fredagsmys. And fredagsmys means a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Friday afternoon of coziness with your own family, what the Danish will call hygge.
Okay.
Have a
Thank you
lovely,
so
lovely
much.
afternoon.
Have a lovely
Yeah.
day.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Abhijit. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Christy. I
Bye.
saw your friendly face the entire time.
We share
Bye.
our sunshine with you
Thank you.
from
Take care.
Singapore. Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.